Hello and welcome to Dialogue. On November the 23rd, the 2021 World Table Tennis Championships kicks off in Houston, Texas, marking the first time for the U.S. to host the event. Chinese and the U.S. players will face off and also team up in the mixed doubles competition at the meet. The event coincides with the 50th anniversary of Ping Pong Diplomacy, when a friendship struck between a Chinese and American player led to goodwill exchanges of players to each country, which eventually led to the normalization of diplomatic relations between China and the U.S. As ties between the two countries have steadily worsened over the past year, could we be seeing a Ping Pong Diplomacy 2.0? Could the event in Texas help thaw the icy relations between Washington and Beijing? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College, Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor at Suzhou University, and Anna Tangen, Independent Current Affairs Commentator. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, ping pong diplomacy. So, and I will start with you. You know, in China, it is well known, the episode starting from individual relationship, which played a very important role in bringing ultimately the two countries together. Are American people also familiar with this episode, ping pong diplomacy?
No, I mean, there's a vague association with Nixon and ping pong, but they really don't know the story. If you asked, 1,000 Americans, I doubt even one would be able to tell you. Maybe if you asked 1 million, one would be able to. You know, table tennis is not that big a game in the United States. It's less than 17 million players who play just recreationally. And the Table Tennis Association only has about 9,000 members.
So are you expecting, this event more or less will increase the awareness of not only the event, ping pong games, but also this specialness of this relationship?
It's just not going to attract enough crowds. They have about 16,000, 17,000 people who are coming to the event. One of the problems is that there's no great white hope on the U.S. side who's going to be playing. It's a game that the U.S. is going to be represented in terms of the mixed teams by somebody who definitely sounds like she has a Chinese name, and then a gentleman who is probably from Pakistan or India.
Well, Victor, why don't you brief us, on this ping pong diplomacy? Why it is still so relevant today?
Well, China and the United States were more or less closed off towards each other between 1949 to 1971. And for many years in between, they viewed each other as enemies, and they fought against each other in the Korean War, after all, in the early 1950s. And then nobody expected that the great breakthrough could be achieved with the American ping pong team visiting China after a very accidental encounter between the Chinese team and the American team in their competition in Japan. This purely was an accident or coincidence. However, I think the Chinese side seized upon the opportunity, and when the American ping pong players suggested that they would love to travel to China to play with the Chinese team, the invitation was extended and the American accepted. So it was purely by accident, but it was also followed through on both sides with careful planning, which eventually led to the great thaw of relations between China and the United States, paving the way for Dr. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China in 1971 and President Nixon's official visit to China in 1972, which again paved the way in its turn to the normalization of relations between China and the United States in 1979. So when we trace the origin back to its origin, it's actually the ping pong diplomacy. So don't underestimate the potential value and impact of ping pong cooperation. And I hope in Houston, again, this time, the mixed Chinese team and the American team for the double competition will again generate a miracle and will make the Americans and the Chinese aware that cooperation is for mutual benefit, and it may actually create miracles for both countries and for mankind at large.
Right, given the importance of the two countries, Professor Rob Ross, how do you describe the essence of a ping pong diplomacy now 50 years, later when we look back, and of course, given this current status between the two countries?
I'm sorry, how do I explain the...
Yeah, the essence of the ping pong diplomacy.
The essence. Well, of course, this was an episode in which we were reaching out to each other with the backdoor diplomacy. And neither side had much confidence that the other was going to be reciprocating its efforts. And so when the Chinese invited our ping pong team to China, this was a clear signal, not just to the world, but to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, that we are prepared to accept Americans to China and that we will welcome them gracefully. And so here was a signal that we should continue with our diplomacy, our secret diplomacy, leading to the Kissinger visit. So this was carefully orchestrated. This is true. The essence is that if we have people-to-people relations and we maintain them, we can signal to each other's countries that we want to have better formal relations. And so here was people-to-people relations, a great Chinese tradition, taking off, telling the world, telling the Americans, if our people can cooperate, we can cooperate. Now we hope today the same thing. As our two countries may be having considerable difficulties, the essence, the importance of maintaining people-to-people relations is all the more important today because it's a foundation of the relationship. We may look at Texas and what's going on in Texas, but in the larger scheme of things, that's one part of a very thick, dense, cooperative people-to-people relationship, and that ping pong diplomacy today represents the success of people-to-people diplomacy.
Anna, obviously, following on that, people-to-people diplomacy. In this upcoming event, we have this mixed doubles competition for Chinese and American players. As you said, the Chinese player like Lin Gaoyuan will partner with the U.S. player Lili Zhang, and the U.S. player Kanao Jia will partner with the Chinese player Wang Manyu. So obviously this is a careful, planned event with the mixed Chinese and American players. So what do you see this consideration behind such a mixed competition here?
Well, first off, this is not being planned by the State Department. This is the U.S. Table Tennis Association. So they're trying to reinvigorate their sport. This is the first time that the championships have been held in the United States. And I think everyone acquiesced because it's hopeful that you can, in fact, rekindle that. But remember, at the time that you had the ping pong diplomacy, it was like a spark, but on dry wood. The issue of the Soviet Union at that time, the complex relationships in the Cold War, U.S. and China were ready to feel each other out about normalizing relationships, and also this gave China some respite from what they perceived as a threat from Russia. So at this time, the question is, does climate change, is COVID-19, the global debt issues, everything that needs to be done to bring the economy back on track. Is that enough? Is that the dry tinder that will be enough to unite two countries in one path? Or will perceived differences in the way that people want to pursue happiness be a deterrent?
Well, obviously that's the challenge. That could be the differences from the last round of ping pong diplomacy, Victor.
Well, first of all, I hope the China-U.S. mixed double team will win the gold medal. And then it will send a very good message to the Chinese people and the American people at the same time, and also the world at large, that China and the United States, despite of all the challenges and difficulties, can still figure out a way to cooperate with each other, to the extent of even forming a joint team, competing on the global stage. I know what Aina said just now. Ping pong is as popular in China as basketball is as popular in the United States. Lots of people in China, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Europe watch ping pong competitions. There are fewer people in the United States, but I hope lots of American people will also be happily surprised to see Chinese athletes and the American athletes joining in the same team, competing for gold or silver or bronze for friendship, but more for competition, but together, not as opposing sides. And if this can be pulled off, why not in many other things? Why should China and the United States rival against each other for both mutual destruction, for example? Why couldn't we figure out a way to get along with each other, to promote each other, to cooperate with each other for mutual benefit? So I see a lot of potential messages coming from this ping pong tournament in Houston, and I do wish the Chinese athletes and the American athletes great excellence and great success in their joint team competition.
Mm-hmm. Robert, obviously the big environment is a bit different, as Anna has described from the 50 years ago. Probably there's a geopolitical attraction for China and the U.S. to come together against the former Soviet Union. But today we see the theme between the two countries in terms of relations, as often described by the U.S. side as competition. So are we going to be driven apart by competition? And are we going to see any rule of the ping pong diplomacy again?
Well, there's frequent discussion of a new Cold War. And we need to understand that this is not a new Cold War. And one of the reasons is because of such events as ping pong diplomacy. In of itself, we don't expect one tournament in Texas to make a huge difference. In the same way, the big difference for U.S.-China relations was the Kissinger-Nixon visits, but ping pong diplomacy was a part. Today, we need to understand that we're not going to have decoupling. We're not going to break off our people-to-people relations because they're too important to people both sides, whether it's in trade, whether it's in travel, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in education. And if you will, that's sort of a cushion for the relationship. It prevents it from going too far south, deteriorating too much when you have such an interwoven connection between the two societies. So one looks at ping pong diplomacy as sort of a microcosm of the larger relationship. And going forward, we can be grateful we have this people-to-people diplomacy. Because despite the voices in both countries that want greater conflict, there are stronger voices that want to maintain trade, maintain financial cooperation. And that's one of the great successes of U.S.-China relations before we began to have greater problems. And so to build on that success going forward will be a cushion. Yes, we have to worry about conflict. Yes, we have to worry about maximizing cooperation in the aftermath of the summit. But we should be grateful that we do have this people-to-people relationship as a foundation.
Mm-hmm. What's your, probably assessment or real assessment of this China-U.S. relationship, in particular after this, obviously rather successful virtual summit between the two leaders, President Xi Jinping and President Biden?
Well, the summit provides us with an opportunity. It's not an end of itself, but it's an opportunity to go forward with a better tone for the relationship. Now that enables the diplomats, the policymakers at the lower level to begin to reach out. After Alaska in the spring, meeting of our foreign ministers, none of the bureaucrats were going to reach out to the other. The signals were clear. We are not cooperating. But after our most recent virtual summit, it's a green light to our diplomats and policymakers to say, explore cooperation, see what you can do. Now, of course, the danger is that if we're not successful, after President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden looked each other in the eye and said, we want to cooperate, if we're not successful, if either side feels that they're not being reciprocated, then it can very quickly go back to that old tension, and it will be very difficult to restore a new tone because of the distrust that will emerge. So we must use this opportunity well and go forward and try and reach agreements on climate change, of course, but also in bilateral issues. The trade relationship needs much help. We want to stabilize the Taiwan issue and avoid conflict where no one wants to go. And of course, we have ways to cooperate on Iran and North Korea. So there's a big agenda, and we must maximize our cooperation on that agenda if we don't want to turn back to greater hostility.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, there's this optimistic atmosphere currently, but ultimately, it's really about implementation of those words and principles agreed upon by the two leaders over there. So are you going to see this restoration of high-level, senior officials, dialogue previously we had between the two countries to talk to each other, or sort of the return of engagement on the high-level officials, let's say?
Well, there has to be some accommodation on both sides. China has been reaching out and saying, look, we need to talk about this. This is about cooperation. Yes, there'll be competition, but ultimately, cooperation at this time is needed because of the gravity of the issues facing the world. For the U.S. side, it's been a containment policy. And it's very hard to reach an accommodation when somebody says, well, I just basically want you to fail, or I want to curtail you. So I think there's a glimmer of light because you had both the United States Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, and also later Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, both say, for the first time by any administration, that China is not going to change, all right? That it is the way it is, and we're probably going to have to figure out ways of dealing with China as it is, instead of wishing for regime change or thinking that democracy is going to just break out suddenly and everything's going to change. So I think there's a glimmer of hope. I would agree with Professor Ross, though. It is a very, very delicate time, and unfortunately, even since that meeting between Xi and Biden, there have not been a tremendous number of hopeful signs from the U.S. There's still high-level engagement is being advocated with Taiwan. I mean, Blinken was in Africa, although he says, I'm not targeting China. They always say, not targeting China. AUKUS, not targeting China. Quad, not targeting China. But, obviously he's there saying, oh, there's alternatives. I'm not trying to make you choose, and this type of thing. So there has to be more than a change of tone. There has to be solid actions, some desire to come to these issues. And I'm surprised. I thought it would always be the environmental issue. And that because, they have an environmental czar who's very keen on getting this done. Obviously, with 30 meetings and that announcement that the U.S. and China were going to cooperate, I thought that this would be the kind of opening that could bring people together. But I'm not seeing it from the rest of the administration.
Unfortunately, the climate change cooperation is a typical example of engagement with each other, of cooperation, how cooperation can bring about, for not only the two countries, but also the whole planet there. Victor, here the issue, if the U.S. side insists on competition or intense competition, that will be the major theme of the relationship between the two countries. The Chinese side said, what, we want to define the relationship as cooperative. Mostly cooperation, yes, there's competition. But if you are, is that possible that China will be forced into competition?
Well, first of all, before we answer China-U.S. competition, for example, we need to ask one fundamental question. What do China and the United States compete for? Does China compete against the United States in men's basketball game? No. China probably will not, unfortunately, win in another 100 years. Does the United States compete with China in ping pong or table tennis? No. The Americans will not win in another 100 years. Does China compete in terms of economic development with the United States? No, I don't think so. Economic development has its megatrend, and it's not up to the government to promote the competition. In China, our exports to the United States roughly include about 1/3, which is made by the American companies operating in China. So China-U.S. economic relations are very much intertwined with each other. You cannot say it's China competing against the United States or the Americans competing with China. Now, fundamentally, the United States considers itself as the top dog in the world. Does China want to compete with the United States for that position, to replace the United States as the next top dog of the world? No, I personally don't think so. China sees no fun of becoming the top dog of the world. So I think we need to make it very clear to Washington that in terms of economic development, yes, China is developing faster than the United States. In less than 10 years' time, the size of the Chinese economy will be bigger than that of the United States. The Americans should look at this as an opportunity rather than as a doomsday scenario. Oh my God, Chinese economy is going to be larger than mine. That will happen. That will not be the end of the tranquility for the Americans, I would say. Now, China and the United States really need to sit down and talk about what about the American top dog position. China does not want to be the next top dog of the world. China wants to deal with everyone in peace and mutual respect, win-win situation. If the Americans want to be the top dog of the world, be my guest. So long as you do not want to force your value system onto mine, your God for you, my God for me, this is not competition. China will not export its political system, its value system onto the United States or onto any other country because they are very unique to China. What works for China may just work for China. It may not work for any other country in the world. So I believe fundamentally there is no competition between China and the United States.
Well, Professor Ross, competition, okay, if you follow the U.S. Definition of competition between the two countries, are we having these rules for fair competition or healthy competition? Some would say constructive competition, instead of that kind of competition that will lead to probably conflict, confrontation, or something even worse.
Well, first, I think it should be clear that we're not competing to be the #1 top dog, but we are competing in East Asia, and that should be clear to everyone. And of course, East Asia is important to both of our countries. After all, the United States fought World War II in East Asia, and of course, East Asia is right on China's borders. So to ignore that competition doesn't help us understand the relationship and how to move it forward. China's not happy with American naval presence in its region, and China has been building up its Navy very rapidly. And that Navy has had an impact on American security alliances. So this is a very real competition. Now, that's very different than saying it's all-encompassing, and it must dominate every aspect of the relationship. Again, this is not a Cold War, and we are not polarized into competing blocs. The countries in East Asia have made it clear they are not going to take sides. And they want to have cooperation with both China and the United States. In that same way, we're not going to have polarization in the relationship. We're not going to decouple. We're going to have trade relations. We're going to have financial relations. We're going to have educational ties. The challenge is to maximize those areas of cooperation, even while we have intense competition in the security realm. That competition in the security realm is inevitable. We are the two most powerful countries in the world. We are destined to compete. That level of competition, however, is something our two leaders have great control over. And so as we go forward, the challenge is to quarantine or to compartmentalize that security competition to allow us to maximize our interests in other areas. Now, this is just a small step forward, but that's the challenge. Nobody wants a polarized relationship which there is no cooperation across any item in the agenda. No one in Asia wants that. Europe doesn't want it. Japan doesn't want it. It's up to our two leaders to find ways to compartmentalize that conflict, that competition, to enable cooperation elsewhere.
Well, Professor Ross, on the bilateral relationship, one issue that standing out is Taiwan. It seems like the two leaders, obviously, it's also very difficult for them to have one meeting and to resolve this their differences over this Taiwan issue over there. Are you seeing that guardrails, using the U.S. word, being built to prevent Taiwan issue running out of control?
What worries me about the Taiwan issue is that the United States is determined to develop better relations with Taiwan in the military world, in politics, in economics, across the board. And we're doing this as part of our East Asia competition policy, to signal the region, to signal China, that America is going to maintain its strength in East Asia. The problem is that this is China's most vital interest. And so in doing this, the Chinese tell us again and again, you're supporting the independence forces on Taiwan. And so China watches this and wonders, where will the Americans stop? How far will they go in supporting the independence forces? And if we don't if we're not careful, we don't know where the red lines are. We don't know where the danger points are. So it's very easy for the two sides to find themselves in a situation where they don't want to be. So I believe that's part of the reason the Biden administration is talking about guardrails. We don't want to end up in a crisis. We need to find ways to limit that competition, control that competition. Now, ultimately, that will depend on America's willingness to restrain itself on Taiwan, to understand that this is China's most vital interest, and that if it doesn't want a crisis, it's going to have to stabilize that relationship, stabilize the level of diplomatic dialogue, stabilize the military relationship, and only then might we have Chinese cooperation on trade, Korea, Iran. It's got to be reciprocal, and the United States must understand Taiwan is China's most vital interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, Victor, as Professor Ross, well said, this, for China, Taiwan is the number one issue, very sensitive issue. Do you think the U.S. side understand that? I mean, I guess they do, because it's been there for 50 years, for more than 50 years, of course. But what's the U.S. pursuing by elevating their relationship with Taiwan?
Well, first of all, I think the so-called destined to war scenario between China and the United States is the false destiny. I think truly between these two great countries, fully armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, any war will soon escalate out of control, and both countries will look into the abyss of an Armageddon. So who really wants to have that pleasure or displeasure of looking into the eyes of Armageddon? Therefore, I think decision makers and leaders of both China and the United States really need to exercise maximum restraint to avoid confronting with each other in war, so that both will be fully naked in front of a potential Armageddon. So I actually very much believe in the inevitable peace between China and the United States. Now, in this overall context, Taiwan issue is very important because it really bears on the fundamental interest of China, and the United States should not really conflict itself. It is fully recognizing the one China policy and that Taiwan is part of China, but it is becoming the largest arms dealer for Taiwan, stoking more fire for independence. So eventually, when there will be a point of no return that some forces in Taiwan will cross, then it will be probably too late for the United States. Now, if you talk about a regional confrontation involving Taiwan, the United States is not going to win the war involving Taiwan, because the mainland-based, land-based missiles cover every corner in Taiwan. So if China really wants to liberate Taiwan or to bring the unfinished civil war to a successful end, I hope the United States will not choose the wrong side and bet on the wrong horse in the Taiwan conflict. I hope nothing like that will happen, because all the decision makers need to exercise wisdom to promote peaceful reunification rather than armed, forceful reunification. But if someone wants to promote unpeaceful reunification, there will be a point of no return. So Washington need to really discontinue this kind of have the cake and eat it mentality.
Well, obviously, Taiwan issue is a difficult issue to be resolved by the two nations over there. But with the ping pong diplomacy, hopefully we can start somewhere, like a people-to-people, closer people-to-people relationship will help alleviate that kind of challenge. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Thank you.